This is the 2024 Ontario Winter Bible School. Our speaker for this second session is Brother Sam Bailey from Christchurch, New Zealand. His theme this week is Deborah and Barak, Inspiring Lessons in Leadership. This is his second class, and the subject for this class is Barak, the hesitant commander. Our reading was taken from Judges chapter 4, verses 6 to 16. Brother Sam.
Well, good morning, my dear brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ and young people. Everyone sleep well? Good. I did. I slept in, which was a good thing, except for when I was running late. So we managed to get to the teens on time, so that's all good. All right, so in our second class, we want to consider the story now as we lead into Barak's calling and the battle. But just to quickly recap, in our last class, we saw the background to the story of Deborah and Barak, a time in the Judges where every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And in that respect, they were not using the law as their guide, and as so, they drifted slowly from God and served idols because they did what they thought was right. And all of that had come about because of a lack of leadership that had come from the faithlessness, in the parents' generation who had failed to pass the truth and the passion to the next generation. And in turn, that generation had failed to personalise the truth for themselves. And as they quickly left the truth, they'd been sold by God into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, a man who should never have been there. This was Jabin number 2, where they'd already eradicated Jabin number 1, but because they had not totally wiped out the nations that remained, Jabin number 2 had come back in full vengeance, and now supported by Sisera, his army chief, they'd put Israel under complete and utter oppression. No food, no trade, too scared to travel, all because of a lack of leadership amongst the nation. And into that leadership vacuum, Deborah had arrived. Deborah the prophetess stepped up to provide God's message and all of God's judgments as all Israel came up to meet her, to understand to her, to come to her for judgment, says Judges chapter 4 and verse 4 and 5. But in that expression, brothers and sisters, is a fascinating thing. I don't know if you'd noticed that. It says, she dwelt, verse 5, under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came to her for judgment. And in that, there's a fascinating thing. You see, she's called, in verse 4, Deborah, a prophetess. And yet all Israel was coming to her for judgment. But what we know when we look back at Judges chapter 2 and verse 16, and Judges chapter 2 verse 18, and chapter 3 verse 9, and chapter 3 verse 15, all the judges previously, it says that God raised up a judge. So just turn back the page. Have a look at in Judges chapter 2 verse 16, right? Nevertheless, it says in Judges 2 verse 16, Yahweh raised up judges. Verse 18, and when Yahweh raised them up judges. Judges chapter 3 verse 9. Look at it. And the children of Israel cried unto Yahweh, and Yahweh raised up a deliverer. Verse 15 of Judges chapter 3. But when the children of Israel cried unto Yahweh, Yahweh raised them up a deliverer, a judge. But this wasn't the case in Judges chapter 4. I want you to notice that. Here, they were oppressed. They're crying unto Yahweh, and yet they're all coming to Deborah the prophetess who's judging, but she's not appeared in the record as being the deliverer. She's called the prophetess. Why was she not the judge? And I think the answer to that riddle, brothers and sisters, is this, that whilst God was with Deborah, because she was called the prophetess, and everyone was going to her for judgment, she was not going to be the Saviour that God was going to raise up to deliver Israel. In fact, God had already called and raised up a judge who had failed to to take on his responsibilities in what God had requested of him. You see, whilst God had already called Barak, due to a lack of courage and a lack of leadership, as demonstrated by his parents' generation, he himself was failing to respond to the call. And we're going to see in this class how Deborah works with Barak, how she encourages, empowers and inspires him to demonstrate the leadership that God had requested of him in the first place. And so, we pick up the story in our reading as we had this morning from Judges chapter 4 and verse 6. And so she sent and she calls Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali, and says unto him, Hath not Yahweh Elohim of Israel commanded, saying, Go draw down toward Mount Tabor and take 10,000 men? Hasn't God already called you? She says. You know, Barak, interesting, brothers and sisters, Barak's name means lightning, a lightning flash. Abinoam means the father of pleasantness. My father is delight. And here he is, the one who was supposed to be the savior of the nation, the one that would fire off like a lightning strike, motivated by the God of his delight, is hiding in a place called Kadesh Naphtali. Do you know what Kadesh means? A sanctuary. And Naphtali means wrestlings. And I think perhaps in here is captured the challenge that was going on in his mind. You see, he was a man who'd grown up within the walls of a city of refuge. You know, it's remarkable. Kadesh Naphtali, brothers and sisters, was more of a sanctuary than most other cities in the nation's history. You know, Kadesh Naphtali, says Joshua chapter 20 verse 7, was a city of refuge. And of course, what was in the city of refuge, brothers and sisters, and young people, were the Levites who were supposed to be expounding the law. This was a man who had grown up within the walls of a city of refuge, a sanctuary from the world, where it was supposed to be full of Levites expounding God's message in God's mind. And yet here he was, a man who was wrestling with the responsibilities of the calling that God had called him to. It was not showing his leadership qualities that God required of him to lead God's people to victory. Gideon's going to suffer the same problem, isn't he? He's going to suffer from the same illness. I'm not capable. I'm not the one. I'm not sure I should be. And God's going to appear to him in this respect in the same way. And brothers and sisters, it can be the same for us, can't it? We can grow up in amazing ecclesias, full of great exposition, where all the Word of God is demonstrated and expounded to us in clarity and vision and excitement, and yet we too can be not standing up and taking our responsibilities in the truth seriously. We're no different, perhaps, than Barak in this story. He wasn't coming to seek judgment from Deborah either. She has to send forth a request to bring him unto her. And look what she says. I want you to notice how she handles Barak, because in here are some vital lessons for each of us as we work together in God's ecclesia. Look what she says. Hath not Yahweh Elohim of Israel commanded, saying? Oh, it's quite a loaded statement, isn't it, when you stop and think about it. Now, hath not Yahweh commanded? Do you know it's in the perfect tense? In the perfect tense. And the perfect tense means that the action's already been completed. And she says, hasn't Yahweh Elohim of Israel already commanded you? Is really what she means. She's already talked to you. He's already talked to you. Do you know what Deborah's saying is this, I think, when you really boil down her things? She says, Barak, you're hiding. You're hiding in this lovely sanctuary of yours. You don't think I know what God's told you? I'm the prophetess. I know that God's already spoken to you. I know that God has already called you. I'm a prophetess, remember. Because I don't think Barak might have shared this with too many people. So she reveals to Barak that she knew what God had already told him. And she says, I know that God has already asked you. And I'm speaking on his behalf again. This is a gentle reminder. If God has to ask you again, this is going to be a different story. And by the way, Barak, it wasn't a suggestion. Hath not Yahweh Elohim of Israel commanded you? This was a commandment, Barak. It's not an option. You don't get a choice in this. God has given you a commission. Ignore that commission at your peril. Do you know the words of the prophet or a prophetess? In Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses says this. He says, I will, Deuteronomy 18 verses 18 to 19, I will raise up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth. He shall speak unto them all that I command him. Deuteronomy 18 verse 18 to 19, and it says, and it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. If you don't do what God's asked you to do, either by my mouth or by him directly, watch out, Barak. And I want you to notice the title of God that she uses in the story, when she reminds him. Hath not Yahweh Elohim of Israel, the title, the full memorial name of Yahweh, synonymous with the covenant that God had made to the fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He who will be the mighty ones that will rule with God. That's who's asked you to do this. And you're ignoring him? Really? I think, brothers and sisters, the record wants to paint a picture of a remarkable leader in Israel, but it's not Barak, is it? It was Deborah. And look at how she approaches Barak to inspire him to step up and to demonstrate his leadership and his responsibility. So you think about this in working with one another in ecclesial life. You know, how could Deborah have handled this situation? Well, there's a couple of options, couldn't it? She could have ignored the calling of God. She could have just said, right, Barak, you're useless. She could have taken control all herself, right? You're useless, right? Let me show that you couldn't even captain a one-man kayak, right? You have no idea what you're doing. You're just absolutely useless. Let me show you what you should be doing, because we can't be waiting for you to go, look, just step aside, move away. This is all my job. I've got this covered, because obviously you're just incapable and incompetent and incapable. She could have done that, couldn't she? But you see, whilst that might have been more efficient, it would have been far less effective. You see, he wouldn't have led anything, let alone anyone. Another way she could have handled him. She could have given him an absolute tongue bashing, couldn't she? She could have given him a dressing down. You've already been told once before, Barak. What's wrong with you? What's in your head? How many times does God have to tell you what you're doing? And you're incompetent. Pull your socks up. Take some concrete pills. Harden up. She could have given him a right royal tongue bashing, couldn't she? But she doesn't choose to do that. See, this might have made Deborah feel better, but any action from Barak wouldn't have been done out of free will and love, would it? It would have been out of fear. Instead, Deborah recognises that God had already called Barak. And instead she realises that Barak was just struggling with the enormity of the responsibility placed on him. And so she coaches him. And she uses a fantastic coaching model that she'd learnt from God himself. And it's a simple formula that we should perhaps also use as parents, but also one that we should also perhaps apply in ecclesial life when we work with one another. You know, and it's exactly the way in which God worked with Adam and Eve in the garden. You see, the first thing she does is she calls Barak aside. She sent and calls for Barak. She wants to have a discussion with him in person and in private. You know, it's never ever helpful, is it, when we're having a work with people in ecclesial life, if we want to do that in front of everybody else. It doesn't work, does it? When we're coaching each other to get an outcome, it's far better to be in person and in private. And she starts by posing a question to understand, rather than an incriminating statement to make them feel small. You see, she phrases the question. Isn't that what God did in the garden? God comes across and says to Adam and Eve, where are you? And what is it that thou hast done? See, God asked again, He knew all that Adam and Eve had done. But you see, she poses a question in the same way that God had done, because he wanted to understand and get a confession. In step 3, she gently reminds Barak of his responsibilities and the plan that God had previously outlined for him. And then she reassures him in step 4 to encourage him that God would be with him. Yahweh Elohim of Israel would be the one to support him. She coaches Barak to action by carefully and gently assisting him to be assured and reassured of God's purpose and the need for him to respond, knowing that God would protect and be with him. And in her example lies some fantastic leadership lessons that we can learn ourselves when we work with one another. And when we inspire each other, it requires us, when we coach each other, to work carefully and prayerfully together. You see, I think even when we think we know the answer, the first thing we must always do is never assume. Even when we think we might know the answer, we first have to seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Shooting first and asking questions, you never get good answers from dead people. You see, people come from all sorts of backgrounds. We never live in a vacuum, do we? We have different experiences, we have different challenges, we have hang-ups, we have problems, we've got issues. We all have those challenges that we're working through and trying to deal with. Nothing happens alone or in isolation. And seeking to understand the problem, we can then work through to find the solution. You know, it's remarkably simple for Barak, brothers and sisters, that when Deborah asks the question, the simple solution was so obvious. You see, for Barak, all he needed was reassurance that Deborah could go with him. Will you come with me? He says. Deborah says, yes. He says, right, let's go. You see, Barak just needed reassurance that God would be with him via Deborah. It was an easy fix. And that's exactly what happened. Often the solutions are the easiest once the challenges are properly understood. And then the second thing is we need to always think about what we're actually trying to achieve. You see, too often in ecclesial life and discussions with one another, we can seek to be right, as opposed to trying to get the outcome that we need to work through. Prior to any discussion, by thinking carefully about what we aim to achieve when we work with one another, and we keep reminding ourselves of the outcome with which we're trying to work through the issues, we might actually surprisingly change our tact in the way we work with one another. Instead of trying to win, let's try and get the outcome. If we continue to focus on the outcome, it often changes our approach. You see, for Barak, if Deborah had whipped him hard, Barak might have gone, but could have chickened out at the end. You see, she carefully and deliberately asked questions to solve the core issue that was sitting at the heart of the problem for Barak. He needed support, that's all. He had an issue that could easily be resolved. She just needed to motivate him to take the lead. And so she knew the way she had to handle him was to get him to take the lead, because that's what God wanted. The outcome was to get the result that God needed. And that's how Christ worked, brothers and sisters. You see, it explains why on the surface things might have been a little bit inconsistent in his approach. You see, with Nicodemus, he turns up in John chapter 3 and bangs him over the head and tells him, if you're supposed to be the teacher in Israel and you don't know these things, how on earth is all these people going to know? To then a few chapters later, to the woman caught in adultery in John 8, he seems to be soft because he's working, brothers and sisters, with everybody that was around him because he was seeking an outcome. See, Christ was working with all the individuals to achieve the best outcome for the truth and for God, for everybody involved, without compromising the principles of the truth. So I think the two key lessons we get from in terms of leadership from the story and at this particular moment is, let's never assume. Let's seek to understand before seeking to be understood, and let's be outcome oriented in the way that we work with one another. Because what Deborah achieved was to coach Barak so that he could see his responsibilities and the need for his leadership, so that he would then in turn inspire others in their walk. See, Barak was going to call the 10,000 men. He was going to inspire them, and the 10,000 men were going to inspire the rest of Israel. And what began by Deborah's careful words begins a cascading of motivation that led to a nation to stand up and actually seize their inheritance. So, what might be the other lessons when it comes to giving and receiving advice? Do you know this is probably one of the hardest things to do with one another, isn't it? You see, there's lessons for each of us as Deborah's and Barak's in terms of receiving and giving advice. You see, we need to try and be Deborah deliverers when it comes to advice. You see, you can show leadership without needing to be out the front. See, true leaders seek to inspire others to achieve greater outcomes and to reach their full potential as far as God wants, without claim for glory or self-fulfillment. It was all about sacrifice for Deborah. She wanted to give, she wanted to help, she wanted to support. She's known as the mother in Israel. And for Barak, well, when we receive advice, true leaders listen to feedback from any source, without bias, listening to the message carefully, not the person giving it. You see, they receive advice from their children, from their peers, from their spouse, from their elders, from their grandparents, anybody that they might continuously improve and to develop in their personal journey and their development with God. We have to receive advice with an open heart and an open mind. You imagine if we could become these two people, brothers and sisters, in ecclesial life. Imagine what could be achieved when we work together this way, where we seek to give advice without personal glory and self-fulfillment, and we receive advice with an open heart and an open mind. God can be glorified magnificently when these things occur. And Deborah is a fantastic example of a prophetess, a woman who, whilst not seeking for glory, provided enormous leadership by seeking to motivate the one that Yahweh Elohim of Israel had called, and sought to inspire him to the task. And in so doing, brothers and sisters, and this is the beautiful thing, she inspires the nation who followed him, not her. And that's why perhaps we can now start to appreciate the title that she gets given. She's a mother in Israel. You see, she saw herself as the nourisher and the supporter of Israel, to care and to provide for the needs of her family. She was a leader so much through, and yet it was a leader behind the scenes to grow and support others in their roles. You see, she looked after them as a maternal mother, seeking the welfare of her children. This was her leadership style, and look how influential it was. So we come back now in the story to why God had called Barak. Why had God called Barak? Well, he's of the tribe of Naphtali. He's living in Kadesh in Naphtali. You see, he was obviously respected by by this tribe, but in this case he lacked the faith and courage to call together his tribe to fight Sisera and his army. And he's going to be taking 10,000 men from the surrounding inheritance. So here's Kadesh Naphtali, and here's Hazor, and here's the tribes that respond to go up Mount Tabor, right? And Issachar also is going to join them, primarily. So you can see that these are the tribes that lived right in the area, in the vicinity of where Jabin and Sisera were. Right? Harosheth of the Gentiles is down here. So these are the nations. Zebulun and Naphtali are the nations, the neighbouring tribes who bore the brunt of Sisera's campaigns. In fact, most of the surrounding tribes are going to assist in the story. Ephraim, Benjamin, Manasseh, and Issachar. The call was going to go out nationwide to fight, and yet it was going to be primarily these tribes that are going to respond because they were feeling the pain mostly. And if you've got a pencil now, just make a connection between this expression in verse 6 and verse 7. She says to Barak, hasn't God commanded you, saying, go and, here's the expression, go and draw towards Mount Tabor and take with thee 10,000 men of Zebulun and Naphtali, and I will, notice verse 7, draw unto thee, thank you, to the river Kishon, Sisera and his captain in Jabin's army. You draw, you get 10,000 men, and you draw to Mount Tabor with 10,000 men. And while you're doing that, says Deborah, God's going to draw Sisera to you. I'll work behind the scenes. You don't worry, says Deborah. God's going to work behind the scenes and do exactly what you need to do. You go and draw 10,000 men, and God's going to draw the rest. And on the surface, it would appear a good military strategy to get to the top of a mountain to fight a man with chariots. But do you know what, brothers and sisters? It was ludicrous. Here's Mount Tabor. Here's a view from Mount Tabor. Has anyone been to the land? Has anyone been to Mount Tabor? Okay, fantastic. Good. So we've got a couple of people that have been. So the view from Mount Tabor, apparently, and I haven't been there, is spectacular. Yeah? You can see almost 300, well, you can see 360 degrees right around you. Mount Tabor looks all the way out to the Mediterranean on one side, the entire Jezreel Valley, right, if you can see a clear day in Galilee, which you never can, and all the way back behind you, right? But the thing about Mount Tabor, and this is what makes it interesting, is that it's a hill. It's really just a cone-shaped hill. It's 400 metres high, or 1,200 feet high, if you like feet. It's slightly smaller than a couple of the hills that we have around us in Canterbury. It really is just a cone-shaped hill in the middle of an incredibly fertile plain. And it made for one of the most outstanding landmarks in this part of Israel, because it holds that commanding view of the surrounding region all the way back to the Sea of Galilee. But however majestic the view, brothers and sisters and young people, it was a ludicrous position to be in from a military perspective, because 360-degree views means you can be utterly surrounded. Barak was going to gather 10,000 men and stick them on the top of a mountain, completely isolated, utterly exposed, vulnerable to siege, and totally cut off from possible help. So the question is, why did God send them up there? Well, I think, firstly, God wants Barak to learn to trust him. So no matter how ludicrous the position was, he wanted him to learn to trust. God was going to show him that without him, he was always going to be trapped. But also, from this vantage point, God was going to treat Barak and the 10,000 men to the grandest military manoeuvring witnessed by man at this point. You know, from here, Barak was going to witness every horse, every chariot, every foot soldier that Sisera is going to be able to muster, a parade that apparently, according to Thompson's Land of the Book, would have marched and filled the entire Jezreel Valley as he marched to meet him. And from here, Barak would witness the utter destruction and chaos that God would bring upon the man and his army. And so Barak says unto her, listen, I've got some challenge. I'm still hesitant, he says. I hear you. But here's the challenge. I need you to come with me. If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go, see here colouring in pencil, with me, right? If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. And she said, I surely will go with thee. Notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honour. For Yahweh shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. You see, this is why he was the hesitant commander. He's still hesitant in the story. I need you to come with me. I need your presence as God's representative, as God's prophetess, to come with me. It wasn't quite good enough for Barak that God would deliver Sisera into his hand. He needed the assurance and reassurance of an association with God. But by requesting Deborah to go with him, he revealed his trust deficiency, and therefore it would come with a trade-off. God says in verse 9, the journey will not be for thine honour, for Yahweh shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. You see, before in verse 7, Yahweh would deliver him into thine hand. And now, because of your trust deficiency, to prove that God would work with anyone, I'm going to sell him into the hand of a woman. You see, whilst Barak believed that God would be with Deborah, let me rephrase that. Whilst Barak believed that God was with Deborah, he failed to understand that God had already been with him. That God is already with him. And for that, God would show Barak that although he would have 10,000 men, that God would destroy Sisera by the hand of a woman. God would be with anyone in the story. Who do you think Barak thought, by the way, would be that woman? Well, the only woman on the battlefield was Deborah. But it wasn't to be so. And from the most unthought of place, God was going to work with another woman to achieve this great victory. So the journey of discovery, the journey of realization, the development of his faith was going to require a trade-off, because he was not quite faithful enough. However, Deborah arose, it says, and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and he went up with 10,000 men at his feet, and Deborah went up with him. Right, there's the other expression, you can colour that in. And here they were, on foot, at the top of this mountain. And verses 10 and 11, we're not going to do much detail because we'll come back to this in our next class. But Heber the Kenite, it says, shows unto Sisera, verse 12, that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor. You see, you can imagine Sisera sitting at home and there's a knock on the door. And either Heber or a servant of Heber's family comes in. Hey, Sisera, guess what? Guess what? There's 10,000 men of Israel gathered on top of a hill. Sisera sprang out of bed like you wouldn't believe, right? Straight out of bed, poof, like that. He was out like a flash. Here, you've got to be joking. What a nut job. Honestly, what is he thinking? Here's the chance. Well, think about it this way. Israel had been walking for the last 20 years through the goat tracks and the byways. Here, Barak has got 10,000 men, all of the fighting men of Israel in one place. Oh, you little beauty. We're going to wipe them out once and for all. This is done. He's gone. He sprang out of bed like you wouldn't believe. And look what it says. He grabs every fighting person he could find. Verse 13. Sisera gathers together all his chariots, even 900 chariots of iron, and all the people that were with him from Harosheth of the Gentiles unto the river Kishon. You see, Barak, as far as Sisera was concerned, had just committed military suicide. Here's the battle array. Here's Sisera. And he rallies the troops, marshals everyone he could. It was the showdown of the century. You see, it says that verse 10, Barak called Zebulun. And in exactly the same expression it says, and Sisera gathered together. He calls together all his chariots. This was Sisera versus Barak as far as he was concerned. Same Hebrew word. Barak calls Naphtali and Zebulun, and Sisera calls together all his army. The ultimate showdown. It was an all-in bet. The winner takes all. You know, it would have been an amazing sight to watch if you were Barak on top of the hill. You know, it's suggested by Jewish writers that Sisera marshalled not only the 900 chariots of iron, but 300,000 footmen and 10,000 horsemen. He grabbed every piece of military equipment and person that could breathe with a sword to come with him. What an incredible sight. And Barak and Deborah and the men of Naphtali and Zebulun witnessed one of the world's greatest military parades as Sisera marshalled all his army down the Jezreel Valley in the Kishon River. Sisera, his name, remember, means battle array. And here was this military maneuvering of the greatest kind seen in its history. And as he marched down the valley, his eyes would have been transfixed on Mount Tabor, his military brain working overtime to hatch a plan to rid themselves of the pesky Israelites out of his territory once and for all. You know, as Sisera reaches the river Kishon, Deborah instructs Barak to move. Verse 14, Deborah says unto Barak, Up! For this is the day in which Yahweh hath delivered Sisera into thine hand. Up! This is the day. Notice what she says next. Is not Yahweh gone out before thee? Oh, that's a beautiful expression by Deborah. Is not Yahweh gone out before thee? In the Hebrew, it's in the past tense. Hath Yahweh already hath gone out before thee? Do you know what her point is? She's quoting from Deuteronomy 9, I believe. It was here where Moses, who had instructed them to pass over into the promised land, he instructed them to realize that Yahweh would go out before them. He shall, says Moses, destroy them and bring them down before thy face. Therefore, so shalt thou drive them out and destroy them quickly, as Yahweh hath said unto thee. God's already called. And what's Deborah saying, brothers and sisters? And I think this is the beautiful thing. Today, says Deborah, is the day that you have the opportunity to fulfill what your fathers have failed to do. Barak. This is the day. Yahweh had already gone out. Joshua and his military campaigns had already taken out those before them. This is the day to finish the job. And I think also, brothers and sisters, that there's a second fulfillment in Deborah's expression. Because Yahweh had physically already gone out from before them. Because as Barak and his men watched Sisera and his army roll down the valley, they also witnessed, when we read Deborah's song, a huge storm brewing, so that whatever dust cloud that Sisera's army might have produced was utterly insignificant to the clouds that were rolling up, the bank of storm clouds coming up the hill country of Judah. And as Deborah says, up, this is the day, because Yahweh's already gone out before thee. As Sisera and his men reached the bottom of that hill next to the river, as they marched down Mount Tabor on foot, the storm that was brewing behind them exploded with terrifying force. You know, Deborah's song in Judges chapter 5 and verse 20, it says, they fought from heaven, the stars in their courses fought against Sisera. And the rain and the hail described by Deborah's song, in torrential proportions, with the wind blowing horizontally behind the approaching army, would strike like arrows, blinding them. The sky was filled with lightning flashes as it bolted across the heavens with thunderous explosions as God revealed his presence and a piece of his majesty. In fact, if you were Deborah, she sings of a song. She says, do you know what? If you were alive at the time of Exodus chapter 19, you would feel the same way as if you were here in Mount Sinai, all over again. It's like deja vu, she says. Look at it, Judges chapter 5 and verse 4. Yahweh, she says, when thou wentest out of Seir, when thou marchest out of the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens dropped, the clouds also dropped water, so much so that the mountains melted from before Yahweh, even that Sinai, from before Yahweh, Elohim of Israel. You see, if you were alive, says Deborah, you would feel the same way you would if you're at the foot of Mount Sinai. The earth trembled. It moved like waves. It's the word that's translated, it shook. And it's the word described in Psalm 68 verse 8 and Psalm 77 verse 18 of Exodus chapter 19 verse 18 of the shaking that was at the foot of Mount Sinai. Psalm 68 verse 8 and 77 verse 18 and Exodus 19 and verse 18. The heavens dropped. That means the thunder and lightning as the clouds descended and blew up. The clouds dropped water. There was torrential rain. The mountains melted. It means to overflow. The water ran as if it just burst springs, like they were just coming straight out of the hill. The mountains looked like they were melting. And it says in Exodus chapter 19 verse 16 that the Israelites were terrified. It says in Hebrews chapter 12, when Moses describes his own emotions, in verse 21, that he himself, I exceedingly feared and quaked, his knees knocked together, even though he knew what God was doing. And so it was in verse 15, that as Barak and his men tore down Mount Tabor, that Yahweh unleashed his rage upon Sisera, and it says he discomfited him and all his chariots. Oh, that's an interesting word in the context of Sisera's name. If Sisera's name means battle array, the word to discomfort means to put into utter commotion, i.e. to place into disarray. See, he completely undoes Sisera in his own game. The military strategist, warlike array, was put into complete disarray and completely undone. Joe, when we pick up the story in Judges chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, and we unpack perhaps what she sees going on in the story, with the horses and the prancing and the river Kishon, verse 22, I'll read to you a little write-up that I wrote just to try and consolidate what went on in the story and perhaps build a picture for you in a minute or two. So here it is. The storm system, as it approached Mount Tabor, burst. Torrential rain cascaded down the mountain, rapidly turning the entire area into a mud bath as Sisera's chariots and horsemen and army marched forward. The cloudburst, accompanied by hail, driven by the wind, screamed straight into the faces of the advancing hordes, forcing them to slow. Meanwhile, the water continued to stream down the mountain and into the valleys, which flowed together, flooding the plain and sinking Sisera's chariots into the rich, fertile soils of the Jezreel Valley, unable to move. The lightning and thunder and earthquakes completely spooked the horses, causing them to rear up and to bolt in their terror. And in their madness, they thrashed about, slipping their harness, tangling themselves into a mess of halters and bridles and saddles. And in their panic, they trampled soldiers and footmen and horses together. And in their panic, they broke arms and legs, killed their soldiers and the footmen and themselves, breaking legs and killing men. And now Sisera and his army stood still. And it was at that moment Barak and his men arrived in full force. The battle, therefore, was not held in chariots. It was held in close hand-to-hand combat. It says in verse 16 that they killed them with the edge of the sword. It was a hand-to-hand combat on foot. And with the army in utter disarray, it was every man for himself. And still the floodwater came. And as Sisera's men realized that they had lost this battle, they turned to flee, the mud slowing their retreat. And Barak and his men, hard on their heels, gave chase. And Sisera's men and his fled, says verse 16. Barak pursues them unto Harosheth of the Gentiles. The floodwater came, and they sprang for home to Harosheth of the Gentiles. You know, Thompson's in his in the book, The Land and Book, in his book, The Land and Book, says this. As they scattered, fleeing for home, they would have raced back down the plain of Jezreel, following the river. On their right was the swollen river Kishon and the marches of Thara. They had no alternative but to make for the narrow pass which led by the river to Harosheth. The space, as it came up the valley, became more and more narrow until within the pass itself was only a few rods wide, which is about 20 metres wide. The horses, and whatever was left of any of the chariots and the remaining men, became mixed in the horrible confusion, jostling and treading one another down. The river here, both now swifter and deeper than any time before, zigzagging from side to side of the vale until it reaches the castle of Harosheth, where it dashes sheer up against the perpendicular base of Carmel. There was no longer any possibility of able to avoid the river. They all had to cross this river. And so he says, you can imagine, rank upon rank of flying and fleeing host plunged madly into it, and those behind crushing those who were before, deeper and deeper into the tenacious mud, where they, then stuck fast, were totally overwhelmed and were swept away by their thousands. And Deborah in her song says, Judges chapter 5 verse 21, the river Kishon swept them away. The river Kishon, O my soul, thou hast trodden down strength. And so complete, brothers and sisters and young people, was the destruction of Sisera, that there was, just like Joshua chapter 11 all over again, not a man left. Joshua chapter 11 verse 18, there was none that remained. The entire army of Sisera, all his chariots, all his footmen, all his horsemen were wiped out. And in that, brothers and sisters, they fulfilled Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 17. But of the cities of these people, which Yahweh thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive none that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them. And brothers and sisters, Barak and his men knew that the only reason that they were having to fight them now was because their parents had not. And so they wanted to complete the mission before now their parents had their parents had failed them so many years before. They wanted to complete this mission, and they utterly do so with tenacity in a way that their parents had failed to do so. And in that, brothers and sisters, is one of the last leadership lessons for us this morning. You see, the lesson for us is this, that true leadership has both the vision and the tenacity to see things through to the end. You know, it requires us to follow through with the discipline and the tenacity on any resolution that we might make long after the spirit in which we've made them has passed. We've got to become completer finishers in the truth, don't we? You know, it's easy for us to give up. It's easy for us to look backwards. And it's easy for us to stop when we've only just started. We've got to not only win each battle, brothers and sisters, but we've got to hold on to the end. Patient continuance in well-doing, firm unto the end. We've got to ultimately keep our focus and keep our attention in order to not only win each battle, but that we might win the war. But even though, brothers and sisters, it says that there was not a man left, there was. Not everyone was destroyed. One particular individual positioned himself for a rapid retreat, just in case. The military strategist genius had devised a plan B option. It was called the escape hatch. And he took off, running in the entire opposite direction on foot. But brothers and sisters, and we'll see this in our next class, God had prepared something extra special for Sisera, and his destiny awaited him when he exited stage left. God had him pegged for destruction, and he ultimately got nailed.